After a bit of consideration and a number of favorable comments, I have decided to try spinning another bit of speculative biology, just for fun. It is another liminal biome, but each of these is quite distinct from the others. The Tulgey Wood was a place with a bright sort of whimsy about it, though there was also a distinctly Lovecraftian undercurrent. This time, the biome is a more wild and unknown sort of place. Our duo of would-be explorers has joined up with an expedition into a newly discovered liminal biome known tentatively as the Labyrinth Coast. It is said by some that there are two kinds of knowledge. The more common, basic sort is relatively harmless. In learning this sort of knowledge, you merely change what you know. There are deeper truths, however, which leave a more profound impression upon a person. In learning such truths, you change something of who you are. I had been suspicious of this classification until recently. It has been nearly 6 months since Charlotte and I left the Tulgey Wood. Neither of us has felt inclined to return, all things considered, though I can tell that she misses the place. It's the only home she's ever known, though I have done all I could to make my own home as comfortable as possible. She had nowhere else to stay, and I owe her a great deal. After all, the samples she helped me to retrieve from that eldritch place have proven remarkably profitable. Winter has come and gone, and warmer weather has left both of us somewhat restless, but there may be a remedy for this. One result of our ventures in the Tulgey Wood was the retrieval of a rather disturbing journal. We were able to find the owner of this journal and return it to them. This has left us in good standing with this influential individual. Somewhat to my surprise, I received a letter just this afternoon. Apparently, a new liminal biome has been discovered, roughly 4 months ago. At the time of this discovery, access was limited by the unfavorable season. Now, as spring tilts towards summer, a proper expedition is being prepared, and we have apparently been invited to join this merry little band. A liminal biome is roughly defined as the biotic and abiotic factors found within a stable expanse of warped space contained between two disparate realities. Each of these unusual places is a realm between the realms, defined by the dimensions and its boundaries. It is possible to cross into these liminal places through a number of thresholds, though the details of these junctions vary with each biome. Some of the liminal biomes have had human settlements for thousands of years, while others have remained hidden from human knowledge until only recently. One of the newest biomes to be discovered is technically listed as Liminal Biome E47. More informally, it has been referred to by initial researchers as the Labyrinth Coast. In actuality, the environment appears to be more akin to an extended salt marsh filled with unusual geological formations. These convoluted forms have a somewhat organic appearance, though a properly thorough analysis is still pending. Life seems abundant at the threshold at least, though the forms are diminutive and relatively simple. Scrying devices detected something resembling an ocean approximately 50 miles inward from the mundane threshold. There may be a span of open shoreline beyond the stone labyrinth, but preliminary readings are as yet confused. A formal expedition is scheduled to enter this biome in a matter of days. The ultimate goal will be to reach this theoretical ocean, though they are likely to take a circuitous route, spending several days investigating the labyrinthine expanse. I write this entry at the threshold of the liminal, gazing through the mist as our crew undergoes their final preparations. It was a long journey through the desolate, empty country before we reached what amounts to an improvised outpost. Having stayed the night, we intend to enter at sunrise, or shortly thereafter. Somewhat to my chagrin, I will not be able to indulge my usual habit of illustration while we explore the biome. The limited accounts from preliminary investigations show a remarkably high level of humidity, sufficient to reduce conventional paper to mush within a matter of days if not hours. There is the option of specially treated paper and ink, which is sufficient for simple written entries. However, the medium does not lend itself to the subtleties of even basic sketchwork. Despite this regrettable state of affairs, there is an upside to this particular expedition at least. A new liminal biome draws the attention of some fairly deep pockets, so I have been provided with a rather sophisticated portable photoeidetic device, myself and 2 others in our band of 7. I would mention something of the 5 beyond Charlotte and myself, but anonymity was one of the conditions for our joining this venture. It is just as well that I haven't disclosed my identity in any prior entries, and Charlotte is technically using a pseudonym. Initial analysis of the Labyrinth Coast liminal biome as of 23rd of May, Standard Calendar. Approximate midday temperature 21 degrees centigrade. Approximate midnight temperature 14 degrees centigrade. Relative humidity 90 to 95%. Atmospheric pressure roughly 1.1 atmospheres. The labyrinthine expanse consists of irregular stone structures arising from limestone bedrock with a thin layer of alluvial deposits. The stone structures are almost universally surmounted by layers of greenish material which may or may not be integral components. Pools of standing saltwater are commonplace, and life is abundant. Autotrophic forms appear to be algal lineages, with the possibility of salt-tolerant bryophytes as well. These are found atop the stone forms and within the saltwater pools. Initial chemical testing suggests cyanobacteria, at least in part. Animal life may be broadly categorized into 3 functional groups, though revision will be necessary when further information becomes available. The first group is the sessile forms, some of which may be found to be fungal or algal rather than animal. General appearances suggest Cnidarian taxonomy, though porifera and echinodermata are also distinct possibilities. The second group is the crawling forms, informally referred to as Scuttlers by the expedition team. While bilateral symmetry is commonplace, there appears to be no clear distinction between vertebrate and invertebrate morphologies. Fish, crustacean, and cephalopod analogues are the most commonplace upon initial inspection. The third group is the floating forms, informally referred to as drifters by the expedition team. As with the Scuttlers, bilateral symmetry appears to be the norm, and there is a similar blending of vertebrate and invertebrate forms. However, the nearest analogues appear to be versions of Cnidarian, siphonophore, and isopod based upon available data. All animal life is as yet relatively diminutive, though there are accounts of larger forms located further inward from the threshold. Classification will almost certainly require revision should these larger forms be verified. It is early afternoon, and we have well and truly left the mundane realm behind. The humidity in this place was not exaggerated. The landscape is veiled in a haze of cold mist sufficient to obscure details even a short distance away. There is a maritime scent to the air, as one might encounter on a beach at low tide, a somewhat unpleasant amalgam of salt and subtle decay. What stands out most immediately is the labyrinthine nature of the terrain. We are surrounded on all sides by towering sculptures of strangely flowing stone, often capped with a thin layer of what appears to be moss of some kind. I suspect that the formations are not strictly geological, regardless of their apparent composition. There are vague suggestions of coral among the forms, though conventional coral formations would be far more intricate. There are pools of fairly stagnant water in the lowest places, and even above the water the ground is distinctly damp. There are just enough stones about to make the terrain difficult to walk over without paying close attention to one's feet. Small invertebrates appear to be quite commonplace, falling into 3 basic categories. There are the sessile organisms attached to the stone formations, the scuttling creatures that creep and climb, and the floating forms that seem to have an unusual buoyancy keeping them aloft somehow. The overall impression is reminiscent of what one might see in a tide pool, though these creatures are above the water. There is little in the way of larger, complex animal life visible as yet, though we have only traveled a short distance from the threshold. I'm only able to take the time to write this entry because the others are busily scouting out potential paths through this maze. The stone formations may be more accurately described as stone trees, though this is an analogous designation rather than a homologous one. The nearest equivalent in mundane space would appear to be Stromatolites, the colonial layered growths of primitive cyanobacteria. However, this is a misleading comparison as the forms within the labyrinth are far larger and more complicated. To refer to one of these structures as a stromatolite would be akin to referring to an oak tree as a clump of peat moss. Night has fallen, and the place has taken on a somewhat more ominous air. Somewhere nearby, one of the larger scuttlers is bellowing with an odd rhythm. I caught a glimpse of such a creature earlier. Its sonorous baritone was sufficient to cast a fine haze of water droplets over its immediate surroundings. Some have tried speculating a bit as to the purpose of such songs, but there are no conclusions as yet. Not nearly enough information thus far. We have been moving towards the sea, presumably, though it is difficult to maintain a sense of direction in this place. It is also difficult to escape the omnipresent dampness. The air itself feels heavier now, as though one might require gills rather than lungs for proper breathing. That being said, breathing doesn't feel at all difficult. There is a richness to the atmosphere. Our resident geochemist has theorized that the oxygen content is heightened in this biome, and I am inclined to agree. If this is true, there are potentially worrisome implications. To my understanding, the heightened oxygenation during the Carboniferous era of prehistory allowed for the development of remarkable body sizes in arthropod life. There are signs that something similar may be happening here. The resident animals have become steadily larger as we've pressed deeper into the biome. If we assume a linear rate of expansion, I suspect we will be in the presence of giants by the time we reach the sea. Depending upon the disposition of such creatures, I wonder if we will reach the ocean at all. For reasons that are as yet unclear, the atmospheric oxygen content is significantly higher than that of the mundane baseline. The implication would be a considerable photosynthetic efficiency in the stone trees. However, it is possible that the animal life incorporates autotrophic symbionts as well. Alternatively, the as-yet unseen ocean may contain the main focus of oxygen production. A sufficient density of phytoplankton might easily account for at least a portion of this atmospheric enrichment. I was awakened this morning by one of the scuttlers nibbling at the edge of my shirt. It was a cheeky little rascal that seemed inclined to pose for me as I sought to capture its image. We've traveled a far distance since then, and evening is approaching swiftly now. Currently, our scouts are seeking out a viable campsite. Most likely, we will endeavor to sleep on one of the higher ledges well above the waterline. This may not be as daunting as it sounds, as we've all felt a distinct lightness in our steps of late. The stone trees, as we've taken to calling them, have grown larger and more fantastical in shape, and the resident animal life has become considerably larger overall. Even the so-called drifters have reached the size of a person's hand, at the larger end of the scale. Preliminary conclusions suggest both an increased oxygen level and a decreased gravitational field. If so, this would make this biome one of only a handful with significantly modified gravitation. As the expedition proceeds towards the biome interior, the average body size of the resident animal life has been steadily increasing. Smaller forms are still abundant, but the larger forms are certainly more prominent. While no dissections have been undertaken as yet, there have been ample opportunities for close study. Most of the varieties appear entirely unbothered by human proximity. They may be altogether oblivious or simply disinterested. Bilateral symmetry continues to be the norm, often with prominent eyes for seeing in the low-light conditions below the stone trees. The air has grown heavier as well, and dense fog is a common phenomenon. Thus, the overall light levels are lowered still further. Scuttler body plans are largely comparable to isopod, amphipod, and decapod forms of crustacean life overall, with variance in the finer details. The heads often have vertebrate features, particularly reminiscent of certain types of fish. The body appendages may be segmented, but tentacle forms are not uncommon. That being said, such tentacles tend to follow the ophiuroid pattern more often than the cephalopod pattern. Or to put it in more common parlance, when these scuttlers have tentacles, they tend to be like the skeletal arms of brittle stars more than the soft arms of squid or cuttlefish. General behaviors observed thus far suggest opportunistic scavengers with decidedly omnivorous tendencies. They may graze on the algal mats, but they will just as readily snap up smaller scuttlers that wander within range. However, they do not seem to actively pursue prey. That said, their metabolism must be quite high, as they all appear to have quite ravenous appetites. Another morning with a curious encounter. This time it was a drifter floating quite close by. It regarded me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. When I procured a bit of hardtack from my supplies, this curiosity became distinctly more pointed. It nibbled appreciatively at the edge of the biscuit for a time before floating off into the tranquil morning air. Though its mouth didn't seem especially formidable, the humidity had rendered the hardtack into something much more like soft tack. The drifters are the most unconventional forms of life encountered thus far within the Labyrinth coast. They appear to be equally at home in the air and in the water, and have been observed moving between the two mediums quite frequently. Further into the biome, the shallow pools have become deeper and more commonplace. This may be one reason for the larger forms of drifter more recently observed. However, the gravitational force appears to be steadily diminishing as well, and there are indications of steadily increasing oxygenation within the atmosphere. All of these factors would support larger body sizes in these airborne creatures. Most of the larger forms are relatively rounded, suggesting the presence of internal chambers filled with buoyant gases of an as yet unknown composition. As with the Scuttlers, the drifters appear to be an amalgam of vertebrate and invertebrate lineages. However, their tissues are more translucent overall, evoking many of the gelatinous forms seen in the mundane oceans. That being said, there is still a clear bilateral symmetry, and sophisticated eyes and other sensory organs are readily apparent. The creatures move with definite purpose, albeit at a somewhat slow gait. Still, they can manage surprising turns of speed under certain circumstances. They also react quite rapidly to subtle environmental changes. An increase in wind velocity will result in most of the drifters immediately seeking water. If none is readily available, they will often move to cling to available surfaces on the stone trees. Anecdotally, both the drifters and the scuttlers appear to be relatively curious, at least where food is concerned. All motile animal life observed here thus far has been remarkably preoccupied with feeding and apparently willing to scavenge virtually anything that is available. Expedition members have had to keep a close eye on their provisions, as the more enterprising drifters have tried to gain access to luggage on several occasions. There is currently some speculation as to the maximum size of both the drifters and the scuttlers. Some within the expedition have theorized that scuttlers at least might grow to alarmingly large sizes deeper within the labyrinth. It is well after dark at the moment, and we're all somewhat on edge. Well, nearly all of us. Nearby, Charlotte seems to be sleeping quite contentedly. I suppose such an outre setting suits her tastes almost perfectly. For the less adventurous among us, sleep has proven more elusive as yet. I suspect the others have nodded off by now, but I've always been prone to insomnia, and recent events have not helped matters. Late this afternoon, our group happened upon an opening within the labyrinth. Not the proper seashore by any means, but a clearing of fairly appreciable size. The reason for the lack of stone trees is as yet undetermined, but there were several especially deep pools of water in the vicinity. Through the mist, we could see what appeared to be a large, oddly shaped rock formation in the midst of this open expanse. This impression was short-lived, as the thing began to slowly move. Thankfully, it was not moving towards us, and it seemed placid enough in its demeanor, but this was still unsettling. Since that time, several of us have caught sight of the occasional large shape moving in the distance, almost altogether obscured by the mist. There have also been faint, deep vocalizations reminiscent of a whale's singing, though deeper and more sonorous. In some of the more extreme cases, we felt the vibrations rather than properly hearing them. Even now, as I try to sleep, I can feel the subtle tremors troubling the air and the stone beneath me. It is at once exciting and mortifying.